is the second part of my story, because it's not just that the West has defined deviancy down for Ahmadinejad and Iran. At the same time, it is also rapidly defining deviancy up for Israel and for those of us in the West who support Israel. Thus, Israel conducts a war of limited aims and clear self-defense in Gaza after years of non-stop terrorist provocation, only to find itself being accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity by the UN's infamous Goldstone report. Thus, Israel announces a 10-month settlement freeze while Palestinian leaders refuse even to come to the negotiating table, only to find itself being accused of being the one that is obstructing peace efforts. Thus, a mid-level functionary in Israel's Interior Ministry announces approval of the fourth of 7 planning stages for housing units in municipal northern Jerusalem, and it sparks a full-blown diplomatic crisis with the American administration, even as the administration continues to make diplomatic overtures toward Iran. A few years ago, when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, I asked the European Union's ambassador to Israel why it was that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was the source of non-stop outrage in the West, while Syria's then 26-year occupation of Lebanon went all but unmentioned and unnoticed. I'll never forget his reply. He said that Israelis are, quote, one of us. We expect from Israel more than we expect from Cambodia or Colombia, end quote. Now, at first, that remark struck me as not a little bit racist and also pretty rich. Here was the representative of a continent that within living memory had condemned 6 million Jews to die because they were manifestly not one of us. Yet now he was condemning the behavior of another 6 million Jews because they were one of us. But in the way these things sometimes are, the remark was also unwittingly instructive. Above all, it put me in mind of a comment by the late, great American philosopher Eric Hoffer, who in 1968 tartly observed that, quote, everyone expects the Jews to be the only real Christians in the world. This is what anti-Semitism is fundamentally about. This is what distinguishes anti-Semitism from other forms of group hatred. Jews are expected to do better. It is routinely demanded of Jews that they be more moral, more principled, more generous, more impartial, more tolerant, more forgiving of their enemies, more inclined to share, more willing to take risks for peace, and so on. Thank you. The Russians can slaughter some 200,000 Chechens, a fifth of the population of that province, as they did over the past 10 years, and the world barely bats an eyelash. But 35 Palestinians are killed over the same period of time in guerrilla combat conditions or terrorist conditions, and it's universally called or denounced as a genocide. And the reason for that is that Jews are supposed to know better, just as they were supposed to know better when Christ appeared among them 2,000 years ago, and they refused to embrace his gospel. This is the paradigm of satanic evil. It is the evil of God's fallen angel, the evil of the people who, unlike those benighted Colombians or Cambodians, commit wickedness not out of ignorance, but in full knowledge and wanton disregard of the good. And so it becomes the common refrain in the West that everything that Israel does is done with malice aforethought. When that mid-level bureaucrat made an ill-timed but basically insignificant announcement about the Jerusalem housing plans, it was universally assumed that it had to have been done with the full connivance of Benjamin Netanyahu himself. The idea that Israel's bureaucracy could be as opaque or incompetent as any other country's being completely out of the question. It is universally assumed that if an Israeli artillery shell should hit a school in Gaza or a refugee camp in Lebanon, it had to have been done on purpose. Again, the idea being that no 19-year-old Israeli gunner might actually be capable of hitting the wrong target. It is universally assumed that the only reason that Israel resists pulling out of the West Bank is simple greed for the land of others, strategic considerations about terrain and position being supposedly irrelevant to the invincible Israeli defense force. So it is that there is now something like a working assumption that Israel never simply makes mistakes. It only commits crimes. It is the student for whom only two possible grades are permitted, A+ or F. Having once been the repository of so many great liberal hopes, Jerusalem of gold, the socialist paradise of the kibbutzim, the perpetual underdog in every fight, it is now the victim of those hopes' inevitable disappointments. Of those for whom everything is expected, nothing is forgiven. And of those for whom nothing is expected, everything is forgiven. So it is with Israel and Iran today.